This week's Parsha is Parshat Vayikra, which is the first Torah portion of the book of Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, and it is the 24th Parsha, or Torah portion of the entire Torah. And this week's Parsha really sort of starts a new topic, a new theme, whereas we ended last week, we ended the book of Shemot with conversations surrounding the construction and sort of implementation of the tabernacle. We now sort of shift to some of the services that would happen in the tabernacle while the Jews were in the desert. And one of them, which we can really learn so much from, are the offerings that the Jewish people would bring. Now, the offerings were animal or sort of flower offerings that the Jewish people would bring, and each offering sort of had its own purpose and its own reason for being brought. And we go through some of the different ones in this week's Parsha, in the Parsha of Vayikra, and we can really gain some valuable lessons from these offerings. So normally, if you've seen any of my videos previously, you know that I don't usually read from notes, but I do have a few notes this week just because I really wanted to make sure that I talked about all of the offerings that were discussed in this week's Parsha, because I feel there are a lot of valuable lessons we can gain from each one. So the first one is an elevation offering. It's called an elevation offering because it spiritually uplifts or spiritually elevates the person who is giving over this offering. And an elevation offering could be brought for many reasons, either to elevate yourself spiritually, to bring yourself closer to God, or for somebody who, for example, they intentionally sinned, but in the Torah there is no prescribed punishment for that sin. So maybe the person would bring an offering as a recognition so that they sinned and that they are remorseful, that they are sorry for what they did, and they would bring this offering to Hashem. This offering would also be brought for somebody who didn't do a positive commandment. So I don't know if we've talked about it before, so I'll touch on it briefly, but there are commandments that are positive and commandments that are negative. A positive commandment says, do this, observe Shabbat, for example. And then there are negative commandments that would be don't kill, for example. So there are do commandments that are positive and don't commandments that are negative. So if you had the opportunity to do something, one of these positives, and you didn't take it, then you might bring this offering as well. And also for the 3 pilgrimage festivals, which are Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, with the 3 times when the Jewish people are supposed to go to the land of Israel, go to Jerusalem. For those 3 festivals, we would also bring an elevation offering. And so the lessons I get from the elevation offering, especially with the idea of the person who sinned intentionally, is that we should own up to our actions, and that is a way to bring ourselves closer to people and bring ourselves closer to God. So if we come to have the realization that we did something wrong, then we should admit to it, we should say that, we should apologize for it. Now, why I say we should apologize for it, with sort of the offerings, how it would work typically is people would lean their hands onto the animal that was, I think in this case it was a cattle. They would lean their hands on to the offering, and they would confess their sins. They would confess their sins, and then they would go through the process of ritually slaughtering the animals. So they would confess their sins onto this animal, which means that they had to sort of admit what they did out loud. Not that they had to say it to everybody, but they did have to admit what it was that they did that led them to this sin that they committed. Now, for ourselves, again, it's really important sometimes to own up to our actions, to have recognition of what we did wrong, to sort of say it out loud, to know it, that we did this in order so that we can improve ourselves and so that we can not do this thing again. Now, I said before it was a cattle that they would offer, but it wasn't always a cattle. So with the elevation offerings, if you had a lot of wealth, you could bring a cattle, but if you weren't sort of at that tier of wealth, you couldn't afford that, so they would bring a sheep or a goat. Now, let's say you can't afford a sheep or a goat, you would bring a bird. Now, we learned something really beautiful. One of my favorite ideas of this whole Parsha is that people would bring the offerings to what they could afford. If they had the resources for a cattle, that's what they would bring. If they couldn't quite do a cattle, but they could do a sheep or a goat, that's what they would bring. And if they couldn't do that, they would bring a bird. And what I think is, again, really beautiful is that it's not like the person who brought the cattle got greater reward for bringing a cattle than the person who brought a bird. Because these people were giving from their means, from their hearts, with the intention of doing the right thing, of becoming closer to God, they were rewarded. It didn't matter what the size of their offerings were. And even further, for the poorest group who brought the birds, the Kohanim in the service, they wouldn't take the feathers off of the birds. And yet, the birds would be put on the altar and they would be burned in fire. And yet they say that it was a pleasant or satisfying aroma to God. But there's nothing really pleasant about the smell of burning feathers. So what the commentators suggest is that why did they leave the feathers on? Because if you take the feathers off of a bird, there's not much meat there. And so it would be embarrassing to the poor people that this is all, like this small thing is all they can give to God. So they would leave the feathers on it, and God would be pleased because they were doing everything that they could to honor God. So Hashem's not really interested in our exteriors or in what the size of our offering is. He wants to know that we are thinking about Him, that we're connected to Him, that we are doing what we can, whatever we can within our own means. And so that's something really beautiful that I think we can get from this week's Parsha. We see it even more so with the meal offerings, which is another type of offering that the Jewish people would bring. So the meal offering was very basic, just a couple of ingredients. It was flour, it was oil, sometimes with a specific spice, and it could be cooked in one of, I think, 5 ways. So there were different ways to prepare the meal offering. But the meal offering was for the poorest of poor people. It was something that they would bring as their offering to God. And the meal offerings, they say that in the Torah, it sort of says when a person or when a soul brings this offering to Hashem. So why does it say when a soul brings this offering to Hashem? So it's because this person is like bringing their soul to God. They have so little, and yet they're giving of themselves to God. And also, the flour is the way that they sustain themselves in life. They make their food out of it. And so for them to be giving a portion of that to God is a big deal. It's giving over a portion of themselves, and it's also putting their faith in Hashem and recognizing that He's the one who gave them this flour in the first place. The next type of offering is our third type of offering here, called a peace offering. Now, a peace offering was a completely voluntary offering. This is something that people would bring just because they wanted to get closer to Hashem. They would bring it when they were feeling really grateful or when they were really recognizing God's presence in their lives in a positive way. When they wanted to express their thanks to God, they would bring a peace offering. And instead of putting their hands on the animal and confessing their sins, they'd put their hands on the animal and confess their thanks, in a sense. They would say what they were so grateful for and what they recognized and why they were bringing this offering and the gratitude that they have towards Hashem. And so I think something that we can learn from this offering is, again, a recognition of all the good things Hashem does for us, and that as a way to draw us closer to God is when we recognize that the good things we have come from Him. The fourth type of offering were sin offerings, and these would be brought when people unintentionally sinned. So unlike the first type of offering, the elevation offering, where people brought them for intentional actions, this type of offering, the sin offering, was for those that are unintentional, accidentally, starting a fire on Shabbat or something like that. So there are a few different ways to interpret this one, but a takeaway lesson from the sin offerings is that if we have intentions with our actions, that we are less likely to go in the wrong direction. So if, you're not supposed to light a fire on Shabbos, or if, in modern times you're not supposed to turn on the light on Shabbat, if you're really, really in the mindset of it's Shabbos and you really feel the atmosphere of Shabbat, then you're a lot less likely to forget and turn on the light on Shabbat. So there is something really nice and really beautiful about being in the moment and being intentional and really thinking about our actions, and that's something we can learn from the sin offering. There are a few other types of offerings that are mentioned in this week's Parsha, but those were really the ones I wanted to focus on. So as a little bit of a recap, we had first was the elevation offerings, which spiritually elevate people, and those, really the takeaway lesson again there was that Hashem is looking for us to give what we can. There are going to be different people who can give more time, more money, more resources, they can do more, they can learn more, they can, whatever it is, more. But Hashem is only looking at us as individuals and what we can do as individual people. What is at our level? What can we give? What can we do? What can we help? What can we learn? Whatever it happens to be, Hashem is looking at us, and that's important, just to think about our level and not to be overwhelmed by the levels that other people are able to do or to feel lesser. Because again, whatever the offering was that the Jewish people could give because of their means, that was enough, and that was satisfying and pleasant to God. The second type of offering that we talked about was the meal offering, which was brought by the poorest of people. And again, seeing how giving in general is just good no matter what you can give, even if it's small, even if it seems insignificant. Really, it's important to give, and that our intentions are really important more than, again, what we actually are giving, but having the right intention and the right focus is very important. The third type of offering we talked about, the peace offering, the voluntary offering, the one where we express our gratitude and our thanks to God. That's something also that is so important to constantly remember and to work on our relationships with God, to know that all the goodness we have comes from Him, and to offer our thanks to Him, not just to talk to God when we need something, but also to thank Him when He has given us something. And the fourth type of offering we talked about was a sin offering, which is again for unintentional sins. We are all going to make mistakes, but it's really important to be focused and to maintain our focus in our actions and our intentions so that we can avoid doing the wrong things unintentionally. I hope you could gain something from this week's Parsha and from the offerings that we saw, and I wish you all a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom.